Good afternoon. Everyone from the TMRE, the Market Research Event team, is getting excited for the conference next month. We have a ton of great sessions for you with so many informative speakers this year. I am excited to introduce Tom Anderson and Tim Lynch from OpenText. As you may already know, OpenText has repeatedly been recognized for their innovative and interesting approaches in text and data mining, especially with the marketing research space. In fact, OpenText has won awards from virtually every research industry trade organization. Tom has spoken at several of our TMRE events in the past and is well known for his pioneering work in text analytics. Without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Tim and Tom.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. Hi, everybody. I'm Tim Lynch from OpenText. Today we're going to cover a lot of material. For this project, we analyzed text responses from over 15,000 respondents in 8 languages, and we're able to do it within 2 hours. So I'm confident that with the time left we have for this hour webinar, we'll have plenty of time to cover what we need to cover. A little bit of housekeeping. If you have a question, don't hold back. Fire it off in the questions area. I will be in the questions area moderating the questions and interrupting Tom where appropriate to get your questions answered. We also have left a little bit of time at the end of the webinar for general questions and answers. And we're going to try to get to everybody's questions during the time that we have. But rest assured, if we don't have time to get to your specific question or we can't answer it right here and right now, we will follow up after this webinar. So with that out of the way, let me turn things over to Tom. Tom?
Thanks, Tim. So as Tim mentioned, we have a very interesting case study to show you today. It's one of many small text analytics polls that we've done on our website to highlight the importance of unstructured data, open-ended comments, if you will. We have a series called Will It Unstructure, where we take structured questions and see what happens to them when you try to ask them as open ends. In this study is a bit different than some of the others because it has multiple languages as well. So we'll be talking about machine translation. But before we get started into the data, let's run a couple of polls here just to see what the audience thinks. Tim, if we can advance to, there we go, the first poll. And this is from a survey that we actually ran just about a year ago among a few hundred marketing research professionals. And we asked them, and answer this question honestly, if you would. Do you sometimes launch surveys either purposely and don't incorporate an open end because it's difficult to analyze after the fact, or do you sometimes launch surveys with open ends and don't do anything with the results? Just curious to see how many of you agree that you sometimes do that for whatever reason, that text data is difficult to deal with, and those that would never do either of those. Just seeing what comes in here. So it looks like sort of what we were expecting, a little bit more so on the agree, almost 50-50. But so this is an unfortunate thing in research right now, especially in an age where response rates are in question. And let's move to the next poll. We have a second poll here that's a bit similar. And in this poll, again from that same survey, we just want to see if it's similar today. Do you feel that open ends are of secondary importance to structured questions? Curious to see how this falls out here. And we're seeing some people voting here, and it looks like okay, and it looks like most of them are disagreeing. That's good. There are some that are agreeing, and thank you for being honest. Looks like about a quarter agree that that's the case, and that's what we were sort of expecting. So let's move on to slide 9 there. Advance. So what we're going to be talking about today, and actually I'll back one slide here. As I was preparing this deck, I actually took a break and took a call with a client who was interested in text analytics. And she said, when we asked, sure, we can look at some of your data, she said, well, we don't have room for an open-end in our tracking survey. It's already too long. And I'm not going to talk much to this comment right now, but I want you to keep it in mind as we go over today's presentation, and we'll come back to it at the end. It's surprisingly something we do hear once in a while. It's not an unusual comment, but we'll see how you feel about this comment at the end of this presentation. So what we'll be going over today is what we learned from just one single open-ended comment question, and how you can do this even across multiple languages, even if you don't speak any of them. So we'll be covering text machine translation. We use Google Machine Translation for this, but there's several machine translation programs that work great, but with ODNText we use Google, and anyone can leverage that. And we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses about machine translation. And this is also very cheap, because if you do something with just one question, in this case we did use Google Consumer Surveys, but this works with any survey panel or your own survey platform. But this was done with over 15,500, close to 16,000 comments in 8 languages for just $1,500. So that's something that anyone can do today, thanks to machine translation and keeping surveys short. This analysis was done in just under 2 hours, not by a PhD or data scientist, but just a regular market research analyst who only speaks one language. So keep that in mind as well. And just in case you hear me say it, I will remind you again and again that all the data that we're looking at is from a single question today. And we're only going to start skimming the top of the iceberg here, if you will. So to start with, the topic we wanted to investigate was initially was, what is American culture? Is there such a thing as American culture? This is, of course, a very hard, difficult question that sociologists spend their whole academic careers trying to answer. And so we wanted to ask that question, and then we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to ask other cultures as well? So that's sort of the genesis of this study. And when you go to do any type of research project, of course, you need two things to begin with. The first is a good question. Marketing researchers used to be really good at asking questions. I think we've gotten lazy, in my opinion. I've been in market research for over 25 years, and you can sort of tell that because of speed and so forth, and of course the speed is important, but it seems market researchers, because cost and speed have gone down, have gotten a bit lazy. We see client researchers, on the one hand, they do realize that short surveys are important, and they usually never go over 15 minutes with their own customers. But often if they go to panel companies, they'll go 30, 45 minutes. Personally, I think 15 minutes is pushing the envelope. Would prefer 10-minute surveys or even shorter, 2 to 3 minutes ideally. But what's happened is these researchers ask lots of questions and then rely on factor analysis or something else to narrow this down. The problem with that is, of course, lots of things. You get bad data. Nobody's going to want to take your 30-minute questionnaire with a bunch of structured questions that only you feel is important. But in either case, whether you're doing text analytics on fewer questions or using structured questions, it's important to start with the good questions. We got lucky here. First iteration, we got a pretty good question. We asked, how would you explain your culture to someone who isn't familiar with it? And this is the same question we ran in every country, the 10 countries across 11 cultures in 8 languages. And we just replaced that orange part there, your culture, with the country in question. So how would you explain American culture to someone who isn't familiar with it? Ran in the U.S. and Japan, and so forth. The nice thing about having a short survey with just an open-ended question is, of course, you can easily iterate. It's very fast to iterate, and you can do it in a very cost-efficient manner. But we felt we got it right with the first initiation here. And again, this ran in 8 languages across 10 countries, 11 cultures, fielded in just 3 days. And as we did the analysis, we actually kept a stopwatch running to see how fast we could get the results here. So as we move on, this is going to be a methodological presentation, of course, but we will also spend a bit of time looking at the findings. I think it's an interesting topic, cultures around the world, something we all have some familiarity with, of course. So step 1 is machine translation. Even if you were Procter & Gamble, the company that spends the most on market research in the world and have all the resources and money available, chances are slim that you're going to have 8 different analysts who are fluent in 8 different languages, Portuguese, Japanese, German, Spanish, etc., to analyze this data. You could do that, of course, and on the right is a screenshot from ODinText where you can see the results of the French comments. On the left, though, is the same data with machine translation. Actually takes 2 seconds to run that translation. And of course, the question we often get in regards to machine translation is it good enough? Won't you lose important nuance and so forth? And the answer to that question is we strongly believe in machine translation when it comes to text analytics. This is not a qualitative analysis per se, though you can, of course, dive at any time as deeply as you want down to the individual verbatims at any time. But what we're looking at here is about 1,500 or more responses per country. So this is very much a quantitative analysis. And so to take an example, if you were working with a company like Jiffy Lube, say, and a comment came in that said, I took my Mercedes into the garage to get an oil change and your staff was very rude to me, I can guarantee you that the text analytics software will handle that translation and catch everything of importance. It'll catch that it was a Mercedes, that the person brought it in for an oil change, that they mentioned the staff and that the staff was rude. None of that will be lost. And a lot of the emotion and nuance will actually carry over as well. But let's move on to the next part, which is topic identification. Something I find myself having to mention a lot to people working with or just starting to work with text analytics is to remind them to treat the analysis the same way they would treat any structured data analysis. Nobody ever opens up SPSS and starts looking at the data typically without having a specific objectives and hypotheses in mind. And that is something that we have to remind market researchers to do with text data. Of course, you can certainly use a data mining, text mining software to just explore the data and find very interesting things. And if you have the time, we encourage that. You would keep PowerPoint or Excel or Word open and take notes as you find interesting topics to return to. But if you really want to be productive, it certainly helps to have specific objectives in mind as you start the analysis. And one of the ways that we teach to very efficiently do that is something we call the top-down, bottom-up approach. This is something we go over in our basic ODinText training with every single user. It's a very simple approach, and if you follow it, you can be guaranteed that you will have found everything of importance, encoded everything of importance in the data, much more so than a human coder could, or that a human coder using any kind of the computer assistance that's available to human coders today. Basically, top-down, bottom-up approach means, on the one hand, you can look for things a priori through simple to more advanced Boolean search if you want. There's nothing wrong with that. If I was looking at ice cream consumption data, then without even looking at the data, I'm going to be so curious how many people mention flavors and how many people mention chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla that I'm not going to want to wait and look at any data to see if it pops to the surface. I'm just going to want to put that in. The more important approach, though, is the bottom-up or the data-driven approach, because even if you don't do anything with the top-down approach, if you have good software, it should identify everything of importance through the bottom-up. And these are often the unknown unknowns, of course, as well, that will surface here. This is the part of the analysis that actually does take the longest. And you can see after completing this part of the analysis, we had 47 minutes on the clock. Oftentimes, this approach is very fast. If you're doing a concept test and you just want to understand quickly what is it that people like about the best concept or hate most about the worst concept, or if you're doing a segmentation and you want to see how is segment 1 different from everybody else or versus segment 2, etc., or what's driving Net Promoter Score the most, that's a very simple topic identification. This, of course, involved 11 cultures in 10 countries in 8 languages. So, and each culture is relatively or radically different depending on your viewpoint. So that's why this part here took a bit longer. Moving on, this process uncovered just over 160 attributes, cultural attributes. So basically more or less 16 per country or per culture in this study. And we're going to focus more on the top 25 that sort of were important across several of these cultures today. But you can dig as deep into this data, of course, once these have been identified. Some of these cultures are unique to just that one culture. Others are, of course, important across several cultures. But 160 attributes, all of them important, statistically significant in some way. So one of the first things to do, if you want to be very quick with analysis in structuring your objectives and hypotheses, might very well be visualization. Most text analytics tools have some sort of visualization. Hopefully it's not a word cloud, Wordle.net, which are pretty much useless. If you rely on those, your findings would be extremely limited. Usually you can't tell the difference between promoters and detractors if you create 2 word clouds out of those groups. So as you can see here, this is a bit different, where we have visualized the 10 or 11 cultures across the 160 attributes here. Those attributes, include both specific topics as well as emotions. And this is how these cultures clustered originally. And you can see right in the middle there we have France, Spain, UK, Brazil. It looks like USA is actually right there in the middle. And then there's other countries spread in the periphery. And so by looking at the visualization here, you might have certain hypotheses come to mind. So you start wondering, well, why is USA right there in the middle? All these countries, cultures, have the same number of completes. Why is that there? Is it that cultures around the world are converging, getting more similar, and becoming more like the USA? That is a hypothesis now that we may want to test in our analyses. Over to the lower left, we see Germany and Japan, very close to each other and far away from everything else. Why would these 2 countries that appear so different geographically, linguistically, and in every other way seem so similar? That might be another thing that we want to look into. Over to the upper right there, we see Canada, French and English-speaking Canada, and they are close together. Of course, they didn't need to be close together, but they are close together, so that means probably that being Canadian is more important than the language, but certainly it looks like there are some differences between French Canadians and English-speaking Canadians. And we can see Mexico is up there and Australia in the bottom right. So step 2 here, we might want to look a little further into this, looking at some of the key dimensions here. If you look at just to the right of Mexico, we have joy. So that's not a specific topic about what they're talking about. That's an emotion and how they describe their culture. So basically it means Mexico and French-speaking Canada used a lot of joy and happiness in describing their cultures when they were asked this question. If you follow that dimension to where it ends, right there in the middle, next to the USA, that is the average, right? So if you could actually continue that emotional line, you would eventually hit Germany and Japan over there in the bottom left, which means there was relatively less joy in comments from Germans and Japanese. Why is that? Why is there less joy in them talking about their culture? That may be something else we want to investigate. Some of these other ones you can see are more specific. Tradition, history, food, and beauty being discussed more in Brazil and Mexico, you can see up top there. Before we start looking at some of the data, want to take a step back and think for a moment, if you were building a survey on this topic, what features would you have as structured attributes? Whether you'd have Likert scales on how much do you think this attribute is reflective of American culture, or whether they were check all that apply or what have you. You would have to have a very long list. Some of the things that we had top of mind were things like baseball, apple pie, white picket fences, barbecue, jazz music, hip-hop, rock and roll. Surprisingly, a lot of these weren't mentioned by hardly anyone. Out of 15,000 or more people, only one or two mentioned baseball, for instance. And a lot of the ones I just mentioned weren't mentioned by anyone. So you would have to create an extremely long list of topics were you to test this on your own. And of course, we don't have to do that in this case. We can just look at and rely on what the respondents are giving us in free-form text, what's top of mind for them, what they think American culture consists of. So let's take a little bit of a look at some of the things for American culture. And one of the things we did here is to look at U.S. culture versus the international average, right, across all the cultures. And so we have in blue the U.S., and these are all significant differences. Those where the U.S. is over-indexing, where the blue bar is higher than the white bar, and those that the U.S. is significantly under-indexing on top there. So looking at the bottom there, freedom, free liberty. Yes, Americans do think that that's a key part of our culture. It's also important in a lot of other culture. You can see that white bar is relatively high, but it's not nearly as high as the one for America, of course. Second from the bottom, you see multiculturalism, extremely far up on the bar for U.S. Surprisingly, very high for every other culture as well. So this is an important aspect of not just American cultures, but a lot of the other cultures that we're looking at apparently as well. This is ironic, I think, because in part, of course, culture is something that makes us unique, and yet multiculturalism is sort of the opposite from uniqueness. So again, this talks to what we saw in the other visualization, where maybe there is some convergence going on. In the U.S., we don't use the term multiculturalism as much as the melting pot and so forth. We're taught from an early age. But this was something that came up in different language, but the same concept in several of the other cultures. Looking all the way up on the top there, we have welcoming and hospitable. Maybe we thought that the U.S. should have this, but apparently we are much lower than the international average. And there are some countries driving that, as we'll see later. Relaxed, laid back. These are things that, in fact, we saw on the slide I just showed you where, yes, it's true, Australians are relaxed or laid back, or at least view themselves like that more so than anyone else. Welcoming and hospitable. Australians and Canadians we saw in that previous slide are more so, or see themselves as being more so of that than Americans do. Moving on, other than what people tell you explicitly, the nice thing about text analytics is that we can read in between the lines and look at emotions at what's being expressed. And so on the one hand, everybody's heard of sentiment, and sentiment has a place. It's nowhere near as important as people think. USA, by the way, in terms of overall sentiment, it had high positive sentiment relative to the other countries. So yes, we are positive, but it's much more nuanced than that. If you look to the right, these are the 8 major emotions from psychology, Plutchnik's major emotions that all psychologists pretty much agree on. There's lots of other sub-emotions that are less important, that are debated. These are the 8 major ones that count. And we can see here, again, comparing USA in blue versus the international average, where we over-index. So there was a lot of anger in a lot of these comments from Americans. A lot of fear and anxiety as well there on the left. So there are some key differences. And of course, at any time as you are visualizing something or see a certain pattern, you can always drill down further and see what's driving that emotion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into detail into some of these comments, but I'll read to you the one on the bottom here just because it's short. The expression of self in the most obnoxious form one can think of: fat, dumb, and ugly, loud and obnoxious. Donald Trump, the ugly American. So disgust was tagged multiple times here for this small comment. A lot of the comments were much longer, like the one on top with fear and anxiety being tagged. The point is we were very impressed by the quality of the comments. I think on the one hand it's because these people can answer the question. They're not tired after going through 15 minutes of useless, repetitive questions, Likert scales, and they can just answer the question in terms of what they think is important. And you could really tell that in all these comments how detailed and thoughtful they were, which of course is a nice thing. I think it's partly due to the fact that the survey is just one question long. And secondly, to some degree, it may also be due to Google Surveys' approach in actually intercepting people in the wild between them and the Wall Street Journal, or them and a movie or a piece of music, something they really want. So we're getting real people, not just panel members, who are actually answering this question thoughtfully. Moving on, and I'll skip some of these more comments. Let's go back to this visualization here. I mentioned Germany and Japan before as obviously looking a bit unique there, yet very similar to each other. This was of special interest to me when I saw that, because I have studied Asian studies for a while in one of my degrees, and this was unexpected. Of course, Japan is an island, rather isolationist traditionally. And Germany is in Europe and very, very different traditions and so forth. So let's take a look at that. And there's a number of ways we could do it. We could compare Japan versus Germany head to head. This slide here has Japan on some of the key dimensions versus the international average. I'm going to jump to Germany slide here because we have a few less on this slide. And it very quickly emerged why these countries are so similar in this visualization. And multiculturalism was one of those things. As you can see, Germany here scoring rather low on multiculturalism, not something that Germans talk about. I understood why this was the case in Japan, because it is mainly just Japanese culture in Japan. In fact, we know that they also tend to, even their movies and so forth, number one in movie in Japan is an anime movie, whereas in Europe, the number one movies tend to be Hollywood movies. But here in Germany, we have a country that has one of the highest immigration rates in Europe, in the world, and they are not talking about multiculturalism. So what's going on here? And of course, as we looked into it, we saw that there was actually 2 different reasons for this same pattern. In Japan, it was the case that they just don't have a good basis of comparison, we believe, based on the comments like, you need to experience Japanese culture to understand it. Had a hard time explaining it, whereas the Germans had other reasons for maybe it's more of a taboo subject. because of the history, World War I and World War II, it's not something that's discussed as much, is what we took out of that. Lots of other things. On the bottom there, you can see where an attribute where Germany over-indexes significantly. Beer and alcohol, something that was the case with Japan as well. The second one there as well, orderly. Both of those cultures tend to reward and admire that trait. So want to save some time for questions, but want to sort of talk at a high level of what we found. We very quickly in that 2-hour period created 28 charts. And you can, of course, go further into the data, but we had charts for every single country versus the international average and a couple of head-to-head comparison, like Canada, French Canada versus English-speaking Canada. There were some interesting overarching themes like the multiculturalism that is becoming more important across many of the countries. We also found that there were significant differences that do endure. There are some important key dimensions in totality as well as for specific countries, and we understood the degree to which they mattered. Emotional analysis was actually very interesting in this case, and that quickly surfaced various political, economic, and current affairs circumstances in various countries regarding corruption, politics, and economics, and so forth. And again, is a great way to uncover important findings in the data. So again, coming back, imagine trying to create a multinational study on a complex topic such as this, the kind of survey instrument that you would need to create, and the cost and length of time, not just to field it, but of course to translate and do the analysis, versus this analysis, fielding in 3 hours, which of course lets you iterate if need be, and analysis and feedback in less than 2 hours. So for those of you who are thinking about text analytics, is it better? This is something that gives you insights that don't compare to human coding at all. Human coders tend to do 10 likes and 10 dislikes. They read the comments in isolation. There's no consideration about whether that person gave a 9, 8, or 10 on satisfaction or purchase intent scale, how old they were, what income they were. All these things can be taken into consideration very quickly with our text analytics. Is it faster? Most certainly. A lot of market researchers are still laboring with Excel. And having an approach like this, text analytics approach, makes sure that you are coding with 100% consistency. There's no intercoder reliability error, and it's very fast and, of course, cheaper as well. So again, thinking about what you might find out about your brand, consumer, or market with just one question, now, the possibilities are really endless and often produce very different types of findings than structured questions, especially if you ask many structured questions in a row. We see that they often blend together as respondents get tired or bored, and they just express, those that stick with it, either their positive or negative sentiment versus really thinking about what's driving their impact. Let's do another poll if we could. And this was also sort of a repetition and also from that previous study. Curious how many people feel that open ends are more important than structured data, equally important, or less important than structured data. We see some of the votes starting to come in here. And wow, okay, this is cool. So we ran this question in that survey about a year ago, and it looks like maybe this presentation had an impact because very few, one person said less important. It was more of a 25%, 50, 25% split in that survey. So I'm glad we were able to hopefully influence or open the thinking in terms of what you can do with unstructured data. It is true, structured questions are important. They don't have to be in isolation. Unstructured together with structured, or mixed data as we like to call it, is really the key. But it's about choosing the right questions, not having a lot of questions. Let's move on to this quote again. So as I mentioned, this type of thinking, there's about 20% of market researchers who have this opinion of open ends. Even if you don't haven't invested in text analytics yet, our advice is put it in an open-ended question. Don't let a tracker go out without an open end. Even if you don't do anything with it, let it sit there at least for when you're ready to use text analytics. Customers really, of course, appreciate the ability to give you feedback. Of course, it's nice. You should listen to it. But you'll find once you start using text analytics that you need less of the structured questions. And you can get so much more. Nothing is more predictive, we've found, of real behavior, whether it's return behavior or purchase actual sales revenue, than the comment data. And we have a good case study on our website about that with over 1 million customers. We have another one coming out with just 400 customers where which I think is even cooler that we were able to show that. Our client was able to show that with using OpenText with a much smaller data set. So we will be sharing with you. You can read about this specific case study on our blog. It's one of the several case studies we have there. We'll be sharing with you, those of you who registered here for this webinar today, we'll be following up with, on the one hand, an email with the digital book of this case study with a few more charts, etc. We are also going to be doing a survey together with the TMRE ahead of their conference in Orlando in October. On October 24th, we will be going through those in a discussion, some of those survey results, which will be all primarily text analytics questions. We're going to push the envelope on that one and probably make that survey 7 minutes or almost 7, 8, 9 minutes. So a little bit longer than I like surveys, but again, it's experimental, and we are curious to see what market researchers think about certain topics. So we'll probably send you a link to that survey as well. And if you're going to be at the TMRE in Orlando, we'd love to see you at our session on October 24th, the NGMR session. Let's open it up to questions.
Tom, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. The one that goes on all the way back to the beginning of the presentation is on using Google Translate. And when you use Google Translate, did you translate the questions of the survey?
That's a good question. So, we used machine translation for the data that came back. For the question itself, we did actually initially translate them using Google Translate as well. But there we did want to make sure that they were legit. So we did run the actual question by a native language speaker. So that's one place. If you're going to ask the question should be in the right language. Ironically, what happened, and I think we did a blog post on this as well, somehow a question in Portuguese got fielded to Americans. It wasn't our mistake. So we got that data back, and analyzing 1,500 comments on a Portuguese question to American yielded some fun and interesting comments. I think some of them actually used Google Translate to back translate that. Others answered in some other unique ways. But yes, I think machine translation is fine for data, but you should check questions with real translators.
And we have a follow-up question on that from somebody else that was in regards to the translation. Were the responses originally captured by the respondent spoken, or did the respondent type them?
These were typed responses.
In their native languages?
In their native languages.
And then we've got another question from Mary on getting a copy of the slides. She's Swiss, German, American, lived in Japan for many years, so this is very interesting to her. And yes, Mary and everybody else, as Tom mentioned, after this we'll be sending out an email with the link to the archive if you wanted to share this webinar with anybody who wasn't on here today, as well as the ebook of this study and future slides. And then, Tom, we have another question in regards to getting the data. This was done, you mentioned, using Google. And the question is that they use SurveyMonkey. Would that be compatible?
Oh, absolutely. SurveyMonkey, Confirmit, Critical Mix, any research now, whoever you're using for surveys, it's just simple survey data. So you can upload any data you want and analyze it.
Right. And then we had another question. I don't know if you know the answer to this one. On the languages that, obviously all the languages that we used here went through Google Translate. Were there any languages that you know of that do not, that you can't use Google Translate on?
Well, I'm certain there are. Not any of the main languages here that we looked at. So they're expanding obviously all the time, but I'm sure there's hundreds of languages in the world, right? You could obviously do the analysis if you speak German or Spanish or French. You can do the analysis in the native language in ODinText yourself and just upload it. But if you're going to handle a multi-country analysis and you want to compare findings across countries and you don't speak 10 different languages, that's where machine translation comes in, and it's really awesome.
Right. And follow up from another question was you talked a lot about speed here and how fast it was to do text analytics on this large data set. But if somebody doesn't have the quote-unquote Tom Anderson level of expertise in text analytics, how long would it take for them to do something like this, or to get up to speed to do an analysis like this?
So our basic training is an hour and a half for ODinText licensees, and they are ready at that point to analyze any data set right out of the box. And are you going to get better at text analytics? Of course, there's some learning curve. It's very short. We've obviously several years of working with text data went into the software, so it's laid out in an intuitive way to drive you to the important findings. We know what researchers need, what their clients are asking for, what the C-suite is asking for. C-suite could care less about sentiment. They could care less whether Pepsi is mentioned more often than Coke one week versus the next on Twitter. They want to know how to drive satisfaction to some degree. More important than that, return behavior and revenue. And so we know that that's what researchers need to do, and that's really what the tool has been designed to do as quickly and efficiently as possible.
Awesome. We do have a question on how effective speech-to-text software for audio recording. I'll reply back to that person. It's I guess in how the respondent is inputting their answer.
Speech to text. I mean, again, there's companies who are offering that, and you can. It's getting better and better all the time as well. Obviously, there is. It's a little bit like machine translation. I think it's a little bit further behind, but it's getting better and better. And I think you could think about it the same way that you think about machine translation.
Awesome. Great. We have a few other questions that are more technical and budgetary, and we have those questions. We will get back to you guys directly off air, so to speak, with those answers.
Yeah,
great. So it looks like.
Go ahead.
It looks like we're all out of time, so I'd like to thank Tom, Tim, ODinText, and all of you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we will be sending you a link to the recording soon. For more information on this topic and information on TMRE, please visit www.themarketresearchevent.com.